More people to come shortly, but for those of you, I think, who may not know, York Center for Asian Research, YCAR, is one of York University's largest research centers that brings together faculty members, students, visiting scholars, community members to do research in Asia and among the Asian diaspora. We have several regional and thematic clusters, and South Asia Research Cluster is one such cluster, and we are organizing this series as part of that cluster. In 2022, 2 years back in fall, we launched a lecture series called Democracy and Democratization, and invited Siddharth Varadarajan from The Wire to launch that series. And just about a little over a year back, in I think spring 2023, we had a session as part of the series on Sri Lanka and the fall of the Rajapaksa regime. And just now we're having another session of a fall of another dictatorial regime. And before I introduce the panel and the panelists, very quickly I would like to draw your attention to, if you have not already seen this, this is our poster series which we have very lovingly put together after many reiterations. We have speakers, our own speakers from York University, but also from outside. Rukmani Barua, a new hire in the Department of History, will be presenting on October 23rd. And Amuna Khan from Syracuse University will be presenting on hydropower nation on Kashmir on November 13th. And in the winter, we have Chris Balcom, a PhD student from politics. And on February 12th, we have Lalit Vachani's, we'll be screening Lalit Vachani's film on Umar Khalid, Umar Khalid, prisoner number 62670 is present. And finally, we have our own Nadia Hassan, who will be presenting on Bill 121 in Quebec. So all of these lectures will take place not in this room, and take place in the York Lanes in the 305, room number 305. So in addition to that, YCAR is very pleased to be collaborating, co-sponsoring the South Asia Film Festival, and that we do that with Himal. And as part of that, we have online films for which you have to register. The information is coming soon, next week. The poster is in making. And the posters will be, the film will be screened every last weekend of the month. And the focus this time is on climate change, and that aligns well with our own Climate Dystopia in Asia series, which will be running on Mondays, again at the end of the month. Before I proceed with the panel, I want to draw your attention to our welcome event next Wednesday on September 25th. I urge you to please drop in. We will have some refreshments, and you'll also get an opportunity to meet other members of the center and as well as other students and visitors. And please look out for that on our website. We have a newly minted website and a new logo, so please make sure that you check it out, and if you have any feedback, please feel free to reach out to us. I would like to thank, first of all, our center coordinator, Risha Filipovich, who's not here, who's helped us organize the series, and Nari, who's here, there he is, recording, our media and communication person. The recording of the event will be available in our YouTube channel, so please look out for that in case you want to watch it again. And last but not least, to our very own Sheikh Hasina, a PhD student in sociology, who has been the person behind the works to making this possible. So a big hand of applause to all of you. Thank you so much. Bangladesh, the panel on Bangladesh's Uprising, Youth Mobilization and the Road Ahead. As you know, on August 5th, the world was actually taken by surprise that the former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, Hasina's rule of the sort of came to a brutal halt, and her autocratic and repressive regime ended by student protests. Hasina, who belongs to the Awami League Party, was in power for over 15 years, and she was ousted by the students who took to the streets starting in end of June, but mostly in July, which is now referred to as the Bloody July. Students were protesting the changes that were introduced by Sheikh Hasina in the government quota system. Even the protest started over quotas, very soon we witnessed that the students were joined by a large number of ordinary citizens who came to question and challenge Hasina's reign of terror and violence. The dramatic developments and ouster of Hasina are described as Bangladesh's second independence. As the new interim government settles into its new role, the world is watching eagerly what comes next. To tell us what was behind the student protest, what was the historical political context that without a civil war and without external interference led to the overthrow of a brutal dictator, we have a wonderful panel of experts who were witnessing the events as they were unfolding. Professor Siddiqi was in Bangladesh when the protest began and witnessed at close quarters what was going on at that moment. Professor Siddiqi is a clinical associate professor in the Global Liberal Studies in New York University. She has also taught in Brock University in Dhaka and founded the anthropology program there. Professor Siddiqi received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Drawing on decades of grounded engagement, Professor Siddiqi's research and writing engages with transnational feminist studies, critical development studies, and anthropology of Islam and labor. Her research has focused on the global garment industry, and she has published extensively on the politics of race, gender, and labor in the garment industry, non-state gender justice systems, and the cultural politics of Islam, feminism, and nationalism. She is currently engaged in a project on discourses of national development and the travels of civilizational feminism. Those of you who are writing and publishing, you may be interested in knowing that Professor Siddiqi sits on the editorial boards of Contemporary South Asia, Dialectical Anthropology, and the Journal of Bangladesh Studies. She serves on the executive committee of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies and is on the editorial board of Rutledge's Women in Asia Publications. Thank you so much for coming here. And our second speaker is Saad Hammadi. Saad is a fellow at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in the University of Waterloo. Saad spent 15 years as a journalist working for among others, the British newspaper The Guardian and the US-based news organization The Christian Science Monitor. He has served in the leadership positions of international media and human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, during more than 2 decades of his professional experience. He's an advisor to the Tech Global Institute, the global tech policy think tank, and was most recently an advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, Irene. He has a Master of Arts in Global Governance from the University of Waterloo. His reports and commentaries are published in The Guardian, Washington Post, Ottawa, Globe and Mail, Hill Times, and has also featured in, his interviews have also featured in the Time Magazine, Foreign Policy, New York Times, BBC, Al Jazeera, NPR. And thank you so much for coming, Saad. And finally, our discussant is Hana Ahmed. Hana is a PhD student in anthropology, and she is literally wrapping up her dissertation as we speak, soon to defend in the month of next fall. And I guess I can say that as a supervisor. And Hana's own work focuses on the politics of indigenous land rights and petitions in the Chittagong Delta. So thank you so much. Welcome again, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Shubha, for that introduction. I really want to thank you personally, Dina and Saad, for coming here today. Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, for coming here today. I hope this will be a good discussion. So I want to start with Dina, first of all. So Dina, you were there when all of this happened. You were in Dhaka in Bangladesh, so when all of this was happening. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what led to the happenings in July and August. So we saw that the uprising in Bangladesh was started by students over corruption and nepotism around government job quotas, and then it eventually went into a movement against discrimination, an anti-discrimination movement. But it really kind of escalated after the then Prime Minister publicly labeled the students as Rajakars, which roughly translates into traitors, and became a wider movement and involving students, teachers, and just general population all over the country. So I was wondering if you could give us a little, like a historical and political context of what led to that movement and the spread of it, and how it became such a massive, mobilization, and what led to the discontent with the Awami League after 15 years, because we know that in 2009, Awami League was overwhelmingly voted to power. So if you can give us a little bit of the context that led to that.
That's a lot. Thank you so much. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Hannah, whom I've known for many, many years. But it's wonderful to be on this panel. Thank you. I wanted to thank Alicia, wherever she is, for helping me with logistics, and Professor Gururani and Sriyoshi. Suddenly there's a lot on Bangladesh, and I'm not used to it. Bangladesh is so marginal, even within South Asia. And, I was sitting there in July and August, a little bit of August, and thinking, wow, this feels very different. All of this interest, not even from Bangladeshis, from non-Bangladeshis. So it's I feel like my subject position as a scholar of Bangladesh has actually shifted a little bit. I kind of need to now think about what I'm saying in a way that makes sense also to people. So if this had been, like having to, talking about Razakar, for instance, it's really quite nice to actually be in this position, I must say. So let me start. Shubhra mentioned a reign of terror. I think for people who were there in Bangladesh, even if not everybody was out on the streets, many people are really processing what was a very traumatic 3 weeks. Very bloody, very brutal, and it was literally happening on people's doorsteps or right next door. So I think what I have done is actually try and write my way through a little bit of my trauma, and I'll try and read a little bit of what it was like. But let me begin with the term. Razakar, which was meant to mark citizens of East Pakistan who had openly collaborated with the West Pakistani army in 1971 as it rampaged through the country. So given the genocidal nature of the violence of independence, and the fact that there was never any real reckoning, legal or otherwise, with those who had sided with the Pakistanis, it's not surprising that the term Razakar accumulated over time a very heavy emotional charge or load, right? That's there. But the figure, so over time, the meaning of Razakar went from signifying active political disloyalty in 1971 to being generally unpatriotic, to being anti-Awami League, to being anti-Mujib, to being anti-Hasina, right? It just collapsed. All these meanings began to collapse because of the way the figure of the traitor can be used in regimes of ruling. And that's precisely what Hasina did, right? Anti-Mujib had to do, it mapped on Razakar very nicely. Razakar and its opposite, the Mukti Jodha. Razakar has no meaning without its other, Mukti Jodha, literally the fighter or the freedom fighter, right? So it began to map onto these other binaries that structured our understanding of politics in Bangladesh. So obviously religious and secular, and I have been called very affectionately by some of my friends, Tui to Razakar, if they say something you don't particularly agree with politically, right? So there's that. So that's there. So there's a whole set of binaries: religious, secular, BNP, Awami League. BNP was the opposition, the only sort of until recently, the only meaningful opposition party, right? Or your Jamaat, not Jamaat, backward, progressive, pro-Pakistani. All of these. Too Muslim, not properly Bengali. You can go on with that. So the term Razakar does a lot of work, both in ruling, but also in society as a whole. And I was thinking this morning, I remembered something really odd. First of all, it was by the time you get to July of this year, and not long before, the situation was very much a George Bush kind of situation. You're with us or you're against us, right? But it also played out, I guess by the time of the uprising, I would say Razakar had turned into an empty signifier as well. It had been shaved, it was unmoored from its original meaning. Basically, it can be used in any way that whoever was in power could give meaning to it. And the narrative of the war, of the 1971 war, had become sort of the Awami League's private property almost. They owned it, they could claim it, right? They could claim exactly what went into it. So Abhashani could not be in it after a while, and other people could not be in it. It had to be, Mujib becomes the person who leads the thing, and Hasina is then the descendant who carries on the program. So it's a particular kind of story. But, Razakar is always there to police that story, among doing other kinds of things as well. But it became really, really absurd at times. And now that my father is no longer alive, I just remembered this story today, how it can be used to vilify opponents, but it can get really absurd. My father's full name was Hafiz Ghulam Azam Siddiqi. And at some point, he was having some problems in his job at the university. And one of his enemies basically spread a rumor saying, oh, Dr. Siddiqi, he changed his name to Ghulam Azam. And Ghulam Azam is the name of the Jamaat, Amir of the Jamaat Islami at that time. To sort of say, because my father was very religious, look, this man is not worthy of being vice chancellor. But that was really absurd. It didn't have any real political aim, but to be called a Razakar is also to be socially discredited, in a sense, to lose face, right? So it has all of these resonances, Razakar. So this is all to say why, when you say there is, even if people know this, to be called Razakar at that moment felt like it was an insult on the dignity of the students, but on the coherence, on the integrity of the movement itself. I think that's really important. I don't know how long I could go on. I want to connect the Razakar thing to the quota movement. So should I just go on, or should I stop?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So there's that. How does this relate to the to the quota movement? As I said, Razakar as a term has meaning only if you have, Razakar is a negative term. You vilify people through it, but that means you valorize the term Mukti Jodha, who were freedom fighters. So over time, there were people who carried guns, and then people who went across the border and sang songs, and who was a Mukti Jodha and who was not became a subject of much contestation for various reasons we're not going to go into here. But this too was actually emptied of significance, you could say. One of the things is that certification at one point, partly because during military rule, the whole story of 1971 was erased by the military. What actually happened was erased, and the whole Pakistani thing was, changed, one could say. Distorted, everything is always distorted. But so, anyway, so basically what the state started to do under the Awami League was certify who was an Awami, who was a freedom fighter and who wasn't. And these had, when you have the state, it has certain stakes. This was a way to distribute resources, right? So of course, when you have, the state certifying who is an authentic freedom fighter and who is not in a system that is not just corrupt, but it's very much tied to this particular kind of nationalist narrative, is a problem. But what Sheikh Hasina did was, in order to consolidate her power and to build up loyalty, she actually used, among other things, the quota system. So she turned the logic of the quota system around in the Bangladeshi constitution of 72. There were quotas, and in the language of the time, it was 1972. So quotas for so-called backward populations, but it's very much like affirmative action or reservations in India. It was meant to give certain groups a helping hand because they didn't have certain privileges, certain kinds of social and cultural capital. So Hasina turns that around and says, at some point, you find that 30% of these quotas for very much sought out government jobs were going to go to the descendants of the Mukti Jodha, right? The original Mukti Jodha are either gone, long gone, or whatever. So this became a problem, not because the student, it was an open secret that most people acquired these Mukti Jodha certificates by, through pledging loyalty to the party. That's how you got it. And many actual Mukti Jodha, some of whom are very well off, and whose children, certainly your grandchildren, don't need any, any kind of help from the state, but authentic, real Mukti Jodha certainly didn't necessarily benefit from it. So the context here for the students is that we're in a world like everywhere else right now in any kind of post-colonial economy where you're following a particular kind of neoliberal developmental regime, and there's lots and lots of inequality. You have Bangladesh's wonderful economic growth rate of 8% and all of this empowerment of women, but you have basically growth without employment. Lots and lots of employment for men and women. And it is that grievance, I think, that really makes the quota system the object of student attention, because they know that, and I think we all know, I was really shocked to find this out 10 years ago, you actually have to pay 70,000, 80,000 takas when you pass your government exams, even to become a very lower level policeman or something else in the country. You can't just get jobs. It's not the qualifications, even when you get the quotas, the system is so loaded with other kinds of ways. Either you have very close ties to the government, or you have lots of money otherwise. So it's in that context the quota system becomes something that the students really, really feel that stands in the way of their future, right? They're not in it, no matter how hard they work. I mean, this is why you have actually Bangladeshis fairly, this was not a working class movement. We can talk about this later. This was people with aspirations of the lower and middle classes. But you have students and others desperately trying to come to the US who are getting stopped at the central, dying in the borders, even of Mexico, which never used to happen. I mean, this is how much inequality has increased, how bleak people's futures are. So that puts, this is happening at the same time as some people are making enormous amounts of money, okay? And we can, and there's this crude instrumentalization of Mukti Jodha discourse, I think, really showed up the essential hollowness of what, of the nationalist discourse. It took out, I think students started making those connections. After all, this was happening in the name of the Mukti Jodha, of the war. What was the meaning of this war if this, if things were this shallow? And so I think this is where there's a great, I don't know, I sent somebody my slides, I'm sorry, I forgot to look at this after I sent, I realized I couldn't. Is it possible to put on the slides?
Yeah.
Oh no, sorry. And I have 3 slides or 4 slides, but on August 15th, I walked toward Shahbag, which was one of the places, one of the main squares. And the next one, well, okay, this is when people, this is a slogan that I found and that I just took a picture of, a poster that I took a picture of before Hasina's fall, right? It tells you what the system was like. And I think this is just to say, why were students so fearless? They had no choice. It's not as though they could go back and send a petition to the government and say, oh, this is not fair. I mean, the unfairness, everything was closing down on them. I think, can I go to the next slide? I think, this just says Vivek or conscience, the state has lost its conscience. No, the next slide then. Okay, if you know any Bangla, I'm assuming it says, Unnoyon lagbe na, we don't need development, pet bhore khete chai. We just want to eat. So this whole discourse of development, you know, it really, obviously you having, you know, metros and bridges, it's all great, but the discourse of development there's a gap between that and filling up your stomach on an everyday basis. And I think that really ties into why, that and one more thing ties into why, thank you, that's all, we can just leave that there for a minute. Why people, then, I think why the students then mobilized against Hasina, that was it. Why ordinary people did, I think, in my view, there was, I have a long thing that maybe I won't read to you, but between two things happened. When I first arrived, I came on July 10th, and then for a short time, I went off for a conference. I went back on the 14th. In between that time, there were a couple of words that I kept hearing. One was agun, the fire. The price of everything was on fire. The market was scorching, you untouchable. People were so angry at the regime. People at all levels were already really angry. And the other word I heard was atonko, terror. Okay? So I think when the students began to be shot down like birds, as they said, they kept saying in the Bangla, pakir moto mere phelse, right? Like as though it were a sport for pleasure, except it was very much like war, right? It was really a war zone, and I think I have to stop, I've talked a lot, but I have a war zone. But I think when people saw that, several things came together. One, this was not the Pakistani army killing. This was our army in our free state. This is why the second independence thing is so important, I think. I mean, I was just sitting there thinking, how could this possibly be happening? And I have this whole thing on Gaza. I kept thinking about Gaza throughout. Because there were too many resonances, starting and Kashmir. Actually, people, I mean, and I don't know where they get their training from, but, you know, they were shooting in people's eyes. The Islamia Eye Hospital actually opened up a whole special unit to deal with that. So the kind of terror, you called it a reign of terror. I'm so glad, because people have not been, you know, we want to talk about that. You know, I'm really glad you mentioned that. But I think for ordinary people, not only were they outraged, but they also realized that this was also their battle. This could happen to them. This was happening to them in a different way. And so the parents came out with the children, because the children could not be kept. But, you know, one minute I didn't know anything about the quota movement. So on July 14th, I was watching it on TV. July 21st, I was out there when some women's march, not with the kids, but we were out on the streets. I wasn't certainly not thinking that, you know, because it became something much bigger. And I think she really began to believe in her own myth, and I think so she kept putting more and more pressure. I mean, maybe that's the violence just kept getting ramped up, and it was impossible. It was impossible to stay home for anybody. Thank you. Onek bole fellam.
Thank you so much for
Sorry, it's really.
No, that's a really good, like, and you were there at the time, so you watched all this happen. So
The rage,
yeah.
I think, of not being able to do anything.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it was like. So thank you so much, Dina, for giving us that overview of like how the whole Muktijutto, the whole war of liberation is politicized, and it was used by the government, and what led to so much anger and resentment, not just to the students, but throughout the country, from everyone. So it was something. So I'm gonna come to you now, Saad. So Saad, I want to ask you about the involvement of the students, and we've seen, and Dina has also talked about why kind of the students became so involved with it and why there was so much of the rage. So there was a lot of enthusiastic involvement, and we've seen this in 2018 that's when the quota movements first started. And there was also a movement from the students at that time on the road safety movement. But then, it kind of fizzled out. So various things happened. I don't want to go into that, but it fizzled out. And we also, like in Bangladesh, there's a history of students being involved with the political movement of the nation at various junctures. But this time we saw a very big participation from students from private universities as well. And in fact, yesterday I was just saying that most of the deaths of student deaths were from private universities. So I wanted to ask you about the situation of student politics in the universities. First of all, I actually want you to comment a little bit about Chhatro League and so the student wing of Awami League and how what its involvement in the public universities is and what led to that kind of resentment against the Awami League, and also what led to the private university students getting involved, which we have not seen before.
Dr. Siddiqi has spoken so eloquently and in great detail, and I think that was required to set the context. And this question that you asked is also so important now for the building of the nation, as well as looking at the past as how these students have functioned throughout history. So Chhatro League is the student wing of the mainstream political party that was in power until very recently and has been in power for 15 years. And there's the opposition known as Chhatro Dog, which is another student wing of another political party. So every mainstream political parties have had their student wings or factions that have been active and functioning in the history of Bangladesh's student politics, particularly in public universities. And unfortunately, the practice or the culture of the student politics, as we would be familiar elsewhere in other parts of the world, is not the same as it has been in Bangladesh. Primarily because they have worked as representatives of the mainstream party, and the way they have worked, it has been a terror, so to speak. In one word, it would be a terror. There's been less about political discourse, political contest, but more about supporting the party in power. And whichever party has been in power in Bangladesh has given their support and endorsement to the student faction, and they have run the show in the public universities. Over the last couple of years, this has expanded to private universities as well, and which has been an utter shock for most of these private universities that has been outside of this grasp of student politics, because the reputation of student politics in Bangladesh, unfortunately, in recent years, particularly since the 1990s, has not been as great. There are great histories of student politics and how they have changed nations for good, including the recent history. If we look at for Bangladesh, how students came up first and then they were joined by the wider population, and Professor Siddiqi said so well about why other people joined. It wasn't just the student movement, but they were the beginners. The problem lies with the way the student politics has been exploited in Bangladesh to just carry on with the party in power, to support, patronize, and create a system of thuggery. We've seen students killed in universities. We've seen politicization of institutions, how students don't get their accommodation in university dormitories unless they have pledged their loyalty to a particular party. Abrar Fahad is one of the students, a bright student of the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, which is an university perhaps popular and what should I say, has not had as much of this politics, unlike some of the other public universities, and yet the death of Abrar Fahad in 2019 really hurt and touched people the way it was carried out by roughly 20 members or students representing the ruling party at that time. So these are horrors of the legacy that student politics has left behind. And I've written a piece recently after the new vice chancellor was appointed at the Dhaka University, who was my direct teacher as well, and I have urged him that this needs to be done without, and Dhaka University having the reputation as the topmost university, public university, and a representative of all universities in Bangladesh, could set that example. That party-based politics has to be done without. I'm a human rights advocate. I've worked at Amnesty International for many years and with the UN systems. Civil and political rights are fundamental, and students must enjoy that right to raise voices for various causes, whether with regards to climate policies, with regards to governance and whatnot. But if they're used to just carry on the baggages and used as the scapegoat to sort of do what political parties, or what mainstream political parties are doing, and justifying them and their actions at universities, that becomes a huge problem, and that's something that that institutions have been grappling with. Academic institutions have been grappling with. More so, I've learned from teachers at private universities, and particularly during the July uprising, that ruling party student leaders were issuing threats to teachers, to students, for coming out on the street. They issued death threats and attacked people as well. And it was to some extent shock for some of the faculty members as well, that they were getting legitimacy or at least the support of some of these academic institutions as well, whether it was out of pressure or whether some of these institutions had their some member of the academic institution were representatives of the party or have had some allegiance with the party, or for whatever reasons, there were student representatives of the ruling parties who were getting preferential treatment in the universities. And even in academic discourses, teachers would be thinking twice about whether to talk about freedom of speech, whether to talk about the draconian laws that are being used to stifle freedom of speech, and they would get resistance from other students suggesting, or at least justifying, why some of these actions were legitimate, or why draconian laws like Digital Security Act is required, and why some punishments were important against journalists. And that wouldn't be in the interest of international human rights law, as we have learned. So to your question about what role students have played in this uprising, this came out like Professor Siddiqi said, and we've read in the newspapers, that it started on the 1st of July, and most of us were not aware that this was happening on the street until the 16th of July, almost midway to that protest that was happening, when Abu Saeed was killed. And that video really moved everyone, including myself. When I saw that video, I wasn't really paying as much of attention because I was far away. I read the newspapers, but when I watched that, it really moved, and I'm sure it moved everybody else. I had spoken to my colleagues. I've been a journalist as well for many years, and I was trying to find out what was happening on the ground. And until that time, it was only students of Dhaka University and some public universities, particularly the Dhaka University, that was doing that, were part of that movement. But then at that point in time, the government closed the public universities. All of a sudden, they made an announcement that that students in the public universities are now, they can't stay there because the universities were closed. The strategy behind that is that most of the students of public universities are residents in dormitories. Once you close the university, they have to leave, they have to move out of the campus, and therefore there's less room and scope for the protest to carry on. So that was the strategy. But with that video, when it spread out on social media, that brought out the private university students. And that got the movement and momentum on the ground. It wasn't as big until then. And private university students don't live in dormitories, they live in their homes, and they were in Dhaka. And when they came out on the street, it got wide attraction. And after that came the people in general. And that's how it got that traction. And private universities, why didn't they come out? It was pent-up frustration for so many years, for so many hostilities that have been carried out. I have worked very heavily on Digital Security Act when it was enacted in 2018. It was enacted in October. You mentioned about the road safety movement, which was happening, I believe, in around July at that time. And road safety movement was also carried out by school students, and they were frustrated with the traffic system. And they had demonstrated so well in terms of how traffic can be managed. Dhaka is a very congested city. It has its own issues. The road space has been less than 6% for decades that I have known. It might have reduced by now because of the way you have this concrete jungles building up. But the students really wanted to show that it can be managed, and they were initially applauded, and then eventually they had to go back, and they came under attack at that time. The reason this is important is, while the quota movement was also, it also happened in 2018, the school students 6 years down the line were students at the university, and this is a movement that was carried out by university students. So this wasn't really a movement carried out by any political party. It was movement from the people in general, people who have been maturing over time, who wanted change, who've been seeing this leadership for let's say from 2018, if we talk about, to 24, 6 years, if not longer. And we've seen that even longer at how this government has been legitimizing actions with regards to extrajudicial killings and justifying them. And there is no rule of law when you have an entire broken system across institutions, whether it's police, the corruption, the nepotism that has taken place, and with laws that are being used to stifle dissent. I have faced this struggle when I was doing the advocacy and campaign on Digital Security Act and how it must be done without. People will really appreciate the work that I'm doing, but they were equally cautious that if they come out on the street to talk about it, they will be landing in jail. We've lost Mushtaq Ahmed, a writer, back in the day in 2020, who languished in prison for 9 months for a Facebook post and then eventually died in prison. And he was just accused under that Digital Security Act, and he's just one of thousands. I had filed a Right to Information Act a request with the government of Bangladesh at that time. I believe this was in 2021, after Mushtaq Ahmed's situation, with very basic questions about how many cases were filed, how many people were charged, how many people were arrested. This was denied, in the pretext that it could jeopardize the trials that were undergoing and the investigation process. I had gone a step higher by moving it to the Information Commission, which is a quasi-judicial body. There, I had the badge of honor being labeled as the traitor and conspirator of the country by the lawyer representing the state. And as you were mentioning about traitor, so and this happened during the Ukraine-Russia war as well. Many Canadians have been, imposed sanctions that they can't enter Russia because of their advocacy. So similar to that, when you are in Bangladesh in this period, if you're labeled as a traitor or a conspirator, please treat it as a badge of honor. So which is what happened to me. Of course, I couldn't be in the country after that because I'm too small to even suggest the kind of persecution that have gone through with people for these years, from intelligence visits to families, intimidation that were happening, and enforced disappearances that have taken place for all these decades, that they've been kept in these secret detention facilities. Some have survived, only few have survived, because most people their whereabouts are still not known, and these investigations are now happening. I probably am just entering into another set of questions of Hannah, so I'll stop here and then I'll let you ask and then I'll speak again.
Well, thank you so much for that, Saad. And I think that was a very interesting connection that you made, that the students in 2018 who were taking part in the road safety movement are now the university students. So they already had that pent-up frustration building up for the last 6 years, and seeing that they are just not taken into consideration. They're not given any kind of attention by the authorities. And also very good points about the level of kind of securitization that has taken place, vigilance that's been taking place over the last 14 years by the government. I want to come back to Dina now and kind of change the path a little bit and look a little bit more internationally, I guess. So we saw that following Sheikh Hasina's resignation, that she went off to India on 5th August, and we saw that a lot of international media had reported that the student protest movement was in fact an Islamist plot designed to destabilize Bangladesh and cause a national security threat for neighboring India mostly. But at the same time, we also did see a lot of attacks on Hindus and other minorities in Bangladesh, and there is a history of communal attacks in Bangladesh. So I wanted you to comment a little bit on that aspect, how that came about, and how has the new interim government been dealing with this situation, and like what impact did that kind of media portrayal of the Bangladesh movement, the student movement, have on the movement afterwards, like now? What kind of impact do you think that media portrayal has had?
Thank you. And thanks, Saad, for actually, that's part of some of those things. So very important points you brought up. One of the things, I was just at a conference in Indonesia where I ran into this British professor, and I was talking about the DSA, the Digital Security Act, how hard it was, whatever, doing my usual anti-Hasina rant, and he said, it could be worse. And I just stopped talking. I was like, okay, fine, I'm not talking to you anymore. It is the "it could be worse" line. And they don't, many people have used, the "it could be worse" is what in Bangla you would call the jujuburi of fundamentalism, the, not ghost, but the haunting, what's jujuburi, it's like the fear of Jujuburi is but there's an old woman, but it's something that's going to get you in the middle of the night, right? If you don't watch out, right? Go to sleep, But it's that fear. I think Hasina successfully leveraged global Islamophobia for a long time. That's the first thing, to garner support for her increasingly brutal regime. So you have a lot of liberal historians and others very well versed in the history of South Asia who will acknowledge what the regime is doing and yet say, but it could be worse, right? And I think she's presented herself from a long time ago as a bulwark against literally the Talibanization of Bangladesh. This is not to say there aren't Islamist movements, and I'll come to that. But it's very, very successful. I mean, it's an argument that continues to hold great appeal, both in Euro-American circles, but I think sometimes, and also Indian, of course. I mean, that's a whole other thing. But also even within Bangladesh, the fear of Islam that comes from 1971 and the ghost of the Jamaat-e-Islam has produced, to me it seems, a hostility and an outsized fear of Islam that is not the same as actually having to deal with real people who are Muslims, some of whom are very radical, some of, so across the spectrum. It's just everybody's the same and they're all going to come get us if we don't remain secular, and the secular has been collapsed into the Awami League. Right? There's that. So that's the first thing I would say, that Hasina has regularly invoked this to get support for her terrorizing regime, and the so-called international community has happily given that support because it works out for them for different reasons. There's that. It's also, and related to this, Bangladesh is placed in the global imaginary of gendered capitalism and Islamophobia in very interesting ways. Bangladesh is kind of the poster child for a certain kind of capitalism, Muslim women's empowerment. Not just women's empowerment, it's Muslim women's empowerment, right? So that makes it even better. And Hasina has been very open to a certain kind of capitalism. I mean, under her regime, and I studied garment workers, and I'm not saying, and I certainly don't believe garment factories are all sweatshops. I don't think they should be closed up. I have a lot of complex analyses of Bangladesh's garment factories and industry. But she signed off on establishing 100 new export processing zones, which I really don't think is exactly what the nation needs right now in order to, it's just giving away money to corporations and her people. This is not unnayon of the kind that helps people. But so people are very happy with her. So I think that's another way people, not that I believe in external intervention, but the support has been very important. Now for India, the support is really, how should I say it? First of all, I think it's really shocking that India, given what's happening in India, and this person, Gregory Stanton, who studies genocide, says that Indian Muslims are in the first stage of genocide. There are 10 stages, so I'm not saying it's about to happen, right? But given what's happening in India, I find it really amazing that any Indian commentators are worried about Bangladeshi minorities. But I think it's a way in which to actually displace attention, among other things, and keep its own constituency better. There are people here who probably know much more about this than me, but I would say that's there for India. But there's also, and I think this spills over into your second question and what's happening. One of the things the Awami League did through the DSA, through the way it ruled its reign of terror, is there are sets of problems, real problems with Bangladesh, with the nation state of Bangladesh that all nation states have in different kinds of ways. So 71 meant you didn't really have an understanding of the place of Islam within the nation state. It was just Bengali ethno-nationalism. What's going to happen to the Chittagong Hill Tracts? What was going to happen to Islam? Where was the place? That none of that was resolved. It was just more, let's just be more and more nationalism. And that doesn't, what's happened now, and why I think you're seeing violence, and I think you'll see the contradictions that were covered over for so long are just coming out. You can't keep them back anymore. There will be violence. There will be violence in the Hill Tracts. One of the many wonderful things these students did, I think they've refused the narrative, that they've refused what I'm thinking of as now national time. So the songs that they had some amazing rap songs, right? But if you look at the words of the rap songs, this guy Shezan, I think, has this Awaduta, but he says 52 to 24, what's the difference? He's just left out 71. You know, they're going back, they're rejecting the 71 narrative. The students, when they said the nationalist time, I call it, so the students, when they said the singer said they wouldn't sing on August 15th, which was a national day of mourning, and I think rightly so, but that's a different issue. But they wanted to say, we won't let it be August until Hasina falls. So they called it July 36th, the day Hasina falls. They've refused that narrative, but that also means we have to deal with all of the other stuff. Okay, so if it's not all about Mukti Chetna, what is it about? We do have very problematic laws in the country that make it very easy to take over Hindu property. It's got everything to do with partition and the enemy vested property. It used to be the Enemy Property Act in 48, and it became in 65, during that war, it had another name. 72, it became something else, but 72, you took over so-called Bihari land, but it is being used against the most vulnerable people who are the minorities, and it's the poorer Hindus who stayed behind, right? So it's so easy to appropriate. This is happening. I am not saying there isn't violence that's happening. It's not violence that takes over everything. I think there's a real attempt to discredit what the students have done. I just saw a post, Kalke from Bothruasa, a very well-known but very Awami League journalist saying, what is your second revolution if it means that, that the other things that are happening, the things that have a 200-year-old history, this tension between what kind of Islam to have, the breaking of the mazars versus the more very narrow, to me very narrow kind of Islam, those tensions, we need to be able to talk about them, we need to be able to not be shut down. I think, rather than discrediting the entire movement, I think the students have done us an enormous favor. And one of my students, a former student at Wright University, whom I met on July 6th, I think, August 10th, he said, I feel like finally we have the space to even think. It's not even just freedom of speech, it's freedom to even think, because we've become so, it's exactly what you were referring to. We've become so used to policing our thoughts because we might slip. I think we've opened up those spaces. They are difficult spaces. It could get more bloody. I'm not saying it couldn't. I don't know. I'm not a policy person, so I don't know more about what's going to happen and how the government is dealing with it. This is sort of what I can say.
Thank you so much for that, Dina. Yeah, I think that's very, very well put, that, there is a problem. We have problems in Bangladesh regarding religious minorities, ethnic minorities, but at the same time, the way it is portrayed by certain...
secularism will save everything.
Yeah. So we need to be able to... I think you also add towards the end that, like, the students have actually given us a chance to now really talk about everything.
Yes.
I think that's great that we're now able to talk about these things.
Hopefully, yeah.
So I'll come back to you, Saad, now.
And that is the problem that we are perhaps grappling with, including with the government. The interim government has set some commissions right now to create those reforms in those institutions. Some critical commissions, such as the Judicial Reforms Commission, Anti-Corruption Reforms Commission, Electoral Reforms Commission, and then a commission to inquire about the enforced disappearances as well. I have some serious reservations about the scope of the Enforced Disappearances Commission that has been formed, because the time frame that has been decided is from from 2010 to 2024, which only addresses the enforced disappearances during the time of the Awami League government. But human rights violations did not begin with the Awami League government, or the immediate past government that has been followed. These violations have happened even before that time. Unless we get to the roots of the problem, this will not be addressed. You will probably be able to get some justice mechanism in place, get some people tried in this system, but you will not be able to ensure that they will not repeat if it is just targeted at individuals, as opposed to this culture and system that has happened for many, many years. And to answer to that question about political climate, it's also very important to ensure that those who've been perpetrators of various political regimes who have come to power in disguise of democracy but have rather led autocratic systems, and that's not an exception with in case of Awami League, be all be put on trial and in legitimate cases of extrajudicial executions. The Rapid Action Battalion, which is a paramilitary force, was introduced during the time of Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which was in power from 2001 to 2006. And that had carried on. Sheikh Hasina, when she was in opposition, had made bold statements about disbanding Rapid Action Battalion, when she'd come to power because of allegations of extrajudicial execution. And she got a lot of rightful popularity because of those bold statements that, well, this will not exist if she comes to power. In 2008, when the elections happened, there are some controversies, but it was considerably fair in Bangladesh's history, and she came with a lot of popularity because of those statements, none of which she lived by, and eventually continued with the extrajudicial executions, escalated to proportions that cannot even be compared. So these things need to change, and for those changes to happen, this interim government has only spent a little more than a month now, but they need to create that system where they're always accountable, where they're able to create that example that any government that comes to power must stand by those principles and values about what steps they're taking, why they're taking. There's a lot of talk about national referendum right now on various issues, including reforming the constitution of Bangladesh. I think national referendum is important because public sentiment is important. Public views are important about what they want about the country. What I feel very important is not to be complacent. A lot of the people in the government right now are people we have heard for these many years, are perhaps friends of many of us, including myself, and we really have expectations that they can make the differences, they can make the changes, because these are people who have spoken about the changes that are required in the system. If they can't do it now, I don't think we have another time to think that maybe it will happen again. This is the time for them to make those changes, to create that democratic environment, to deliver a fair judicial process. The question about the international community and the letter that I sent to the Foreign Minister of Canada, this was with regards to having independent international investigative mechanism to investigate all the human rights violations that have taken place in Bangladesh, not just during the time of Sheikh Hasina, but beyond that period with a longer scope, under the mandate of the UN Human Rights Council. I must also clarify that there has been some discussion with Dr. Muhammad Yunus and the Office of the UN Human Rights High Commissioner, Volker Turk, regarding a similar investigative mechanism offered by the Office of the Human Rights High Commissioner, and that's underway because Dr. Yunus has also agreed to it. The UN Human Rights Council's mandate will only empower the capacity and resource of this investigation, and my urge was that please do not just limit this investigation to only during the time of Sheikh Hasina, because then you're only addressing one party's actions as opposed to the systemic human rights violations that have happened and been legitimized by other parties. So it's upon the consideration of countries and governments of the likes of Canada, they can make the difference. I don't, like Dr. Siddiqi, I've also mentioned that this cannot just be said that this is the decision of a sovereign state. The human rights violations that have happened, I believe in shared accountability of the state. I think the international human rights instruments are used only as tools by political parties just to get that popularity and support, and eventually they do not abide by them, and this is deeply problematic. We've seen these examples with the situation in Gaza, in case of Ukraine. Gaza has been so frustrating with the Security Council's role over there. Every time, because of one language here and there is this disagreement between all these countries that come up with resolutions. This continues to repeat. It's highly frustrating as it has been in case of Bangladesh for this last 15 years about how the government legitimized their actions. Every time we talked about Digital Security Act, they came up with a new law called Cyber Security Act, the same way, just a change in the word. That's it, we've changed the law. We're no longer doing Digital Security Act anymore, but the actions remain the same. And this is the same in the international space as well. It's grim what I'm saying, but we need to be optimistic, create that pressure, and speak truth to power wherever we are. And it's important for all of us in this space.
Thank you so much, Saad, for sharing what about the letter that you sent to the government, and also thank you so much for bringing up the aspect of the fact that it's not just the Army League that has been carrying out these human rights violations and these surveillance and all of that. It started long before. We have seen the same things when BNP was in power. And then we've had several phases of the military being in power as well. And we've seen all of this. It's just that Sheikh Hasina has managed to maintain it for 15 years and it was not going to end anytime soon. So we are going to go and take some questions from the audience. But before that, I wanted to ask if you, Dina, wanted to add anything to what Saad just
I think
mentioned?
that's really important, the point about it's a systemic problem. I mean, and as you say, and I think the Hasina government raised it to a high art, escalated beyond belief, but it was there. The system was already there. The one thing I'll say about the government, the caretaker interim government, is that, nobody expected Hasina to fall, right? We were all sitting in Dhaka taking bets. 6 months, 1 year, not real bets, but she seemed to be there forever, right? And so when she fell so suddenly, we have to remember that this interim government was put together miraculously, I thought, all things considered. And so we have to give them a little bit of slack, not slack, we have to keep that in mind, but I think also Hasina has managed to completely eviscerate all institutions in Bangladesh. So police, of course, we saw what happened, there was total noidatro. We were all really afraid at night because, the police were all her police, right? The army was, but also just the judiciary, everything. There were the universities, as you pointed out, there was nothing that, everything seems to be needing to be built up. So it's going to take a lot of time. And I think these people weren't necessarily ready to try and, they were ready to talk about what needed to be done. But our friends, many of them, but to actually have to be in that position and make decisions, I'm not saying that one shouldn't critique them, I'm just saying it's a particularly hard position, both the suddenness and the fact that there's so much emptiness.
Thank you for that, Dina. Can we get some questions from the audience? David.
Surprise. I can. Oh, you want that for the
Taped,
report?
probably,
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
It's not asking a question.
Oh dear. Unwrapping it. I think that the both of you have opened up an area that I think is difficult to talk about, but we should, which is that the very complicated relationship between what goes on inside Bangladesh and what goes on in the larger world around it. You mentioned the India connection. India is heavily invested in Bangladesh, and not just in the public sector, but in the private sector.
Right.
One of the things that Hasina did was give away huge amounts of investment capital possibilities to Indian investors. And as you know, that the rich people in Bangladesh are also heavily invested in international markets of various sorts, where what goes on in the world of multinational investment is really important to what goes on in Bangladesh. The national debt, the question of the ability to borrow. I was just reading, Dina gave me a very interesting article about the scale of the national debt and the extent to which it has grown under Hasina's giveaway program for the last it was very recently actually a very huge increase in this debt regime. Her regime is really being held up by a massive amount of debt. So there's this question of the contingencies that are connected between the relationship between borrowing and human rights, or borrowing and the policies of various governments. I think if you look at cases like, I mean, you don't have to go very far. You could just go to Myanmar to simply come to the conclusion that the ability of governments to do what they do in the horrors that they perform is not just a result of what goes on in there, but the result of international investors and various governmental support for these regimes. So the extent to which the international community, you might say, will be involved in the improvement of the situation in Bangladesh is actually something to really think about it and talk about, and I'm really glad you raised that question. But I just want to raise the private sector dimension of it as being important also. And I think Mohammed Yunus, from that point of view, may be the ideal person to be leading the interim government, because he may be someone who could actually convince the investor and the loaner community that human rights in Bangladesh are actually important. So I think the students have done us all a big favor by opening up a big crack in the relationship between multinational investors and local repressive regimes. And so I want to thank the students for that. But anyway, that's a question as to how to talk about these things. It didn't sound like a question, but it really was.
Right. Should we take some questions together, or do we have lots of time?
We have a bit of time.
Oh, okay.
So we can take individual questions.
Sanobar has a question.
Shubha, you go ahead.
I have a very, first of all, thank you to Hannah to have posed those questions, and both of you to have addressed them so well. Gives a very good sense of what's happening on the ground, especially what was the student movement about. And we have seen in India, for instance, the student movement in JNU, which was a very hopeful movement, and it crashed in ways. So one is watching very closely, and as you're saying, we do not know what's in store, and I think that's exactly the case. My one question was a curiosity, which I haven't really, just a little bit about what's been happening, is the role of the army. What happened? What happened to the army, and why are we not hearing more about them, and where are they now with Yunus in power? Can you speak to that?
Shubha, that was exactly my question.
Oh, there's another question.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, sure.
It's not a question, just a correction. Regarding the student politics, I agree with the contemporary politics, but it has a very noble cause, the student politics. Let's go back to 1952, when the student movement started without any cronies or any supporter. They had another thing, because at that time, East Pakistan was basically a agrarian community. There is no national bourgeoisie. It's basically petty bourgeois. And their sons are coming to the universities. And it is they who defended the interest of the petty bourgeois. Like this movement is basically petty bourgeois movement, as Dr. Siddiqi is mentioning about that. Okay, that's another question. So I'm trying to make a little bit of revision of your statement that student politics is always that bad. Not necessarily. Thank you. Secondly, I refer to your question. I don't think, I haven't seen any work about development of capitalism in Bangladesh of late. And with the exception of Afghan works, I think primitive accumulation, agricultural capital, otherwise I haven't seen anything. But the capitalists that you are talking about in Bangladesh, they're not the international capitals. They're the local capital. They are supported, sponsored by the state, the way that the Korean capitalist development took place. It is exactly, this is the same path. But in our case, what happened, is that my notion is that I call it feudal capitalism. Why? Because in Bangladesh, they don't make a distinction between profit and rent. So this combination of the rent and profit, which they got to make a distinction, I don't think in Bangladesh capital accumulation has got taking place along that line. It's not pure capitalism. It's a rent collection. It's through the rent that has been given by the state to those capitalists, and those money siphon off the country. So I know that you did some work on women and capitalism and generalization of capital. Can you give any idea about the way that capitalists evolved through the crony capitalism or what I call feudal capitalism? Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I am an obscure person. My name is Rahim. I am Hannah's uncle. I was teaching at University of Waterloo for 25 years.
Welcome. Thank you.
And development studies.
Could we have the responses to the first set of questions? Because we have 3 questions. Otherwise, it'll get a little overwhelming. So can we have the first round of responses and then we can go to the second set of questions?
Yeah, do you want to start?
Yeah, let's start.
So I'll start with David's question very briefly. My understanding of the role of investors, and you've actually made more than a question, you've also given your statement, so I kind of agree to that investors, businessmen, they have a huge responsibility given that the garment sector is so important for Bangladesh's exports and revenue and labor rights, and I've worked in that space as a journalist for many years on worker rights, and obviously, as mentioned, she's done a whole body of work there as well. I think this rights protection needs to happen, and the government has, some of them have already spoken about how they want to bring the workers and the investors or businessmen together so that there is also transparency in that space of work, so that you don't have these disputes with wages and rights protections in that space. And then the international community's role in there that you mentioned. Policies are very important. My assessment says that China has been pursuing this role of principle of non-interference, and that kind of gave hope to the previous dictatorial government in Bangladesh that could be one of the relationships to forge. India, being the largest democracy, is not too far away from that kind of aspirations either, because it has that power to build in South Asia, being an economic power there as well. So human rights gets diluted in the process. The kind of leadership that they need to have is unfortunately not in as much of a display as they have with regards to who needs to be in the government. And India plays a huge role to influence those operations, not just in Bangladesh, but in other countries around the region as well. So it's very important. That's why I mentioned about this shared accountability for human rights, which I don't know when it will happen or if ever it will happen, but it's very important. It's there on the paper, it's just not there in practice. It needs to be upheld, and it needs to be raised at sessions such as the Human Rights Council, where Canada too is seeking its membership for its 2028-2030 term. And I have been reminding them that if set some priorities for yourself with regards to what needs to be the human rights parameters and what needs to be the human rights work of states. So they need to speak up as much as other countries, and it's best done in groups, in coalitions, and with allies than being alone. The second question about army that you asked. Army didn't really have much of a choice when the students took over, and then it was joined by the wider population in case of Bangladesh's uprising. The kind of threat that Sheikh Hasina had, except for creating a safe passage for her exit, they couldn't really protect themselves. They called for a curfew, which didn't sustain for even seconds. So they knew that we better not go too far than what we have done already in terms of damage. They have to speak for themselves, for the actions that they have taken only days before with a shoot-on-sight order by the government at that time that issued it. So it's it's going under the, what should I say, it's going under the carpet. It shouldn't happen. They should also be held accountable for some of the actions that took place. But they have also, in the process, ensured this transition to the new interim government. It's good that they're not taking the lead. It's not an army-backed government. And it better be that way for the kind of aspirations that we see in the people for government in Bangladesh. So Army's role right now is there to only aid and facilitate, which is what it should be, and when they're required. To your question about student politics, I probably couldn't clarify myself well enough, but I think student politics is highly, deeply, very much important. What I tried to say is the party-based, partisan politics that has been in practice since 1990, we've seen with, I'm sure people from that time also have those horrors and terrors of people who, or student leaders who ruled at that time, and it hasn't been much different with wielding machetes and guns by students who've carried out terror inside the campus. That's what I'm talking against. I am very much appreciative of the 52 movement for language, which was carried out by students. The civil rights movement in the 1950s in the US was so important. There are so many examples of student politics. The most recent that could perhaps resonate with the younger generation is the climate movement led by Greta Thunberg since 2018. So these are all examples of student politics. It shouldn't be about which party one should support and therefore which student should exist in the campus. That has been the problem with Bangladesh's student politics. That needs to change. It must be abolished without any excuse of anything. I mean, student politics should be promoted, and that needs to come under a discipline and under those scrutiny that there is no party-based affiliation. Students must have that freedom to speak about causes, not about which party to support. Like, if I could clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. Dina, do you
Yeah, okay. Gosh, David, that thing, you don't need the slide anymore? I'm doing, or that's taping. Oh, I see, the light is just in my eye. Yes, thank you for that very good question, David. What does real democracy mean? Are we just going to get it? I think Professor Yunus is a wonderful human being, but I think he's much too open to getting yet another IMF loan.
Yeah.
Okay, that is the problem, I think. It's not going to help. You can have some notion, talking of workers, so here is my critique. You can have some notion of the factories working, right? People getting paid maybe even on time. But that doesn't mean the workers will necessarily get justice if they don't get living wages. They're not going to get living wages. They'll get human rights. Maybe they won't be caught under the DSA, which they do get, But so there's a longer conversation there that is much, that's really complicated. And it's not fair maybe to expect anybody to come up with solutions for that. But it is problematic. Yes, Bangladesh is full of crony capitalism. There's a lot of, rent seeking and giving away going on. I do think there are openings for other kinds of ways. People are really also trying to do other kinds of things. And no, there isn't a good history of capitalism in Bangladesh. You're right. So.
More questions?
Thank you for that.
Many
Okay,
more
we have another
questions.
question.
Hannah, this side, the 4 questions.
Okay.
Just
Lots of questions.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, I'll request everyone to keep the questions short so that we can have all the questions in. Yeah.
This is more a question, I think, of anthropological. Let's reconstruct further.
Okay.
And there has obviously been a rise of Rohingya refugees arriving in Bangladesh, and they have received mixed reception from what I understand. So I was just thinking in terms of Islam, the role of secularism and so forth, but also the fact that Indian media, and I'm so glad you called out Modi,
Please.
as
Not
an Indian
just
Muslim,
Modi,
I'm very
though.
happy to, but
Right,
yeah,
but
the
I
whole
mean,
lot.
a lot of Indians are called
Liberals,
liberal media.
absolutely.
It's way beyond Modi and his
Indians are
regime.
definitely very obsessed
Okay.
with what about secularism, and it's like,
Yeah.
you look what secularism did to Indian Muslims too. But I was just wondering, there has been an obsession, like in presenting, oh, look at this atheist blogger who was killed in Bangladesh. Look at this queer cafe that was, attacked by Islamists. And there is this unfortunate narrative that I've often come across that if you bring in more Rohingya refugees, Bangladesh's future will become more Islamist. I thought it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on both Islam and citizen and non-citizen. Yeah.
This must be an Indian thing, because I've never heard of this.
I think there were
Hi, thank you all three of you for organizing this, and honestly the conversation was so insightful and really enjoyed hearing it. So going back to something we were talking about, Professor Siddiqi, you mentioned that it wasn't a working class movement, which it absolutely wasn't, but I think when we talk about Bangladesh, it's very difficult to not think of the class divisions that we have, especially in terms of politics, which has been captured by the elite for whatever regime we've had, whether it's BNP or Awami League, it's always been captured by the elite. But the fact of the matter is that most people in our country are working class, and their concerns and their livelihoods barely ever come up in the politics because the discourse is always related to development, whether it's Padma Bridge or Jamuna Bridge or the metro, and those are the things that we celebrate. So now that we have this interim government, and then we're going to have the elections at some point, we don't know when, but there's a power vacuum, and the only party that we have is BNP other than Awami League. There's the Jatiyo Party, but that's not, I don't think they can gather enough support. It was also shocking that the leftist parties weren't anywhere to be seen during the whole movement, but I just wonder, do you see a path forward that brings in the concerns of the working class without a new party being formed when there is another election? And this question would go to both of you.
A difficult question.
This side, you have lots of, this side is being left out.
Thank you for that conversation. It's been very useful. I had several questions, but in the interest of time, I'll just ask one. This is about the quota, since that's what catalyzed the movement. The logic of quotas is usually to address historical discrimination. And often anti-quota movements can be reactionary. Now I know that in this case there was this new quota category, but I'm wondering if we can speak or speak to and nuance the larger terrain around quotas now.
Two more. Okay, three more questions.
Yes, is that okay?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm not in charge, she's in charge.
No, thank you so much. This actually kind of relates to the question of class. I was really struck by how centrally emotion figured in both your talks. This discussion of anger and terror and so on, and and also the fact that it seems like this was really an uprising of an outpouring of popular anger, right? So I was just wondering if that sense of anger and injustice can be seen as classed, and how that might play a role in the way the movement kind of unfolded. Yeah, thank you.
I think, one sec. One sec. Can I just take over this? Could you just pass the mic? I think we'll wait to have some questions and responses, and then we'll go.
I go this way. Okay. Maybe I can just start with the last one and then go backwards to the other two. Yeah. That's a really, really interesting question, and I've been thinking about this in terms of, yes, affect. I think, democracies promise, post-colonial democracies promise a certain kind of aspiration towards social mobility, having the good life, something like that, right? That's why you have Shadinata. What does it mean, independence? You work hard, you get something. Your children go to good schools, you get a house, whatever the version is, right? And I think what you saw was for these categories are horrible categories, like sociologically, but we'll use them anyway. For the lower middle classes and the middle classes, whatever that means, those aspirations had been cut off after a while. So yes, I think the injustice the sense of injustice, the rage was classed, but it had something to do with the horizon of what was possible. They were suddenly seeing that even that was not possible. I will say what was interesting when we were on this, apparently what was called the Droho Jatra or something on August 3rd. When we were walking by, there was a rickshawala who suddenly got up and stood. Right? I saw him, and he was just standing there. He wasn't part of the movement. He was saluting the movement, and I thought that was really, really interesting, because it wasn't quite their movement, but there was solidarity. Okay. And then when we went by a little bit further, over in between these, now Dhaka has these overbridges or whatever on which the highways are, and there are people living in those spaces, and I took a picture of them too. They weren't paying attention at all, right? So yes, it is class. That doesn't makes it a particular kind of injustice, but it's still there. I think that's very important to understand. Not everything needs to be like, we don't have to valorize something called the working class. I think it's really important to look at the whole picture, right? But thank you, that's a really important question, which goes back to the question of, will anybody bring, did I miss anything? Oh, there were, okay, yeah. The quota, let me just get, the larger, I think, it's never been, I understand in India, of course, there's, because of caste and religion, quotas are a huge problem. In Bangladesh, it's not a problem. What is really interesting, I thought, about this quota movement is that the young women, I feel very bad never talking about the amazing, women were at the forefront of this. Young women, they were so eloquent. I just saw them when you were hearing them speak, I was just floored. They cut through all of the discourse, they had fantastic analyses, but one of the things they said is they refused the 10% quota for women. It was the young women who said, we don't want this quota, we don't need this quota. We want people from the Chittagong Hill Tracts and various other places to have quotas. I thought that was really interesting to think about. They wanted to take back the logic of historical injustices. And I'm not sure all women, a lot of liberal middle class women are very upset over this. These are Dhaka University students, mainly, these women, who just were out there on the streets, stopping trucks, they were doing all kinds of things. But they were just not interested in quotas. And, we who are older, who are we to say, as Shirinapa said, who are we to say women don't need quotas? But it was very interesting. I think the quota movement only became a movement because of the job, because government jobs are so desirable, because once you get them, they're very low paid. But how many people can even aspire to a corporate job? Getting a corporate job needs a whole bunch of cultural capital. Most people will never get there. So getting a government job is the most you can do. And even then it's so hard. That's why the movement was built. But I don't think it's nothing like the US or India. It's a very different situation in Bangladesh. Okay, leftists, and the working class, the CPB, the main leftist party was an Awami League, party, so obviously. So that's not, the typical leftists you can't think of. There are smaller groups, for instance, underground, I suppose you could say, there are people who are saying, well, where are queer rights? Where are, working class rights? There's a lot of smaller conversations happening. I don't see, unfortunately, we don't have an opposition. I'll tell you, even in Gulshan, the last day, the Gulshan people, that's the more elite part, finally had a rally too. And of course, I went late, thinking rally, though it must last for 2 or 3 hours. So I went 36 minutes late. It was already over and they were already marching. But they marched around Gulshan, but it was great. So apparently, they went around Gulshan, they were marching against Hasina, then they went to Khalida's, and then they said, We don't want Hawaban, we don't want Awami League. Don't think, madam, we want you either. And we don't want Jama. I mean, it was just like, no, we want an alternative. And I think we don't have it. I don't think we have a party that does it. But I think that's really interesting. Bhashani, yeah. Who's going to do Bhashani? If only we could get a Bhashani kind of party. Yeah, Bhashani is seen as too Islamic. I mean, right now some of the discussions on Islam are really. I've never heard of this Rohingya and Muslim thing. It's an Indian obsession, clearly. It must be because I mean I worked somewhat. I mean I've got at least one quite in-depth article, but I think. The Rohingya were welcomed a lot, not even because they were Muslim, but just because literally they were, and I don't think Muslimness had anything to do with it one way or the other. They were initially welcomed a lot, but it's a poor country, They're of course, so-called host countries always have problems with after a while. So there has been a lot of tension, there's a lot of violence in the camp, there's a lot of things that need to be done, right? But I don't, I don't think Islam is playing, and people, my friends who go and work in the camps are like, oh, these people are very Muslim and they're going to have child marriage. But I will say that in Myanmar for the last 60 years, they were not allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to read and write. The only things that they could pass on was, through the Quran, through Islam. So of course, you have to contextualize what is going on with the Rohingya, but there is nothing, I don't know anything, and I don't know if either of you have heard about it. Yeah, so.
I'm sorry, I think we have 4 eager questions, so
more
if
questions?
we can take some more questions, 4 of them, so please, may I? Go ahead, please come short.
Hello everyone, thank you for this very insightful and informative discussion because I'm coming from a different background. I'm from a Middle Eastern country, I'm from Iran. 2 years ago we had this women life freedom movement,
sure.
And I'm shocked to the similarities you mentioned with my country, like the neoliberal agenda for development in structural inequalities and also even the eye targeting in the movement and this massive drug that we experienced. Yeah, exactly. But my question, make it short, is for us, always the game changer factor is the superpowers of China and Russia. They always interfere. Their strategical interests always interfere with the regime change. So my question is, did you face such a challenge and how did you solve it? And just another question, I make it quick, in my country, Iran, we had this revolution, my parents, and they overthrew this aristocracy regime, and then they have all of a sudden, within a year, they have this religious authoritarian theocracy. So it's a thing. And also we have 10 years ago, we have Arab Spring, which now after a decade, they are facing serious challenges with secularization. They are concerned about it because they are losing it, in Tunisia, especially women are struggling. What would be the post-revolution steps for Bangladesh? That was my question. Thank you.
Hi, great panel. My question built on the class questions that were just discussed, and it's something you also mentioned. I want to push back. It was a middle class movement, but it had a lot of working class nature. As you already talked about, it gave a lot of expression, and it wouldn't have been really successful without the workers' role in it, including garment workers, right? Who died? There were garment workers who died, and also some of the brave resistance to this regime has been through strikes from tea workers, from the strikes for the national minimum wage, which has not been addressed yet by the interim government, and there's continual unrest. And as the panelists have said, we have hopes for this interim government because many of them were critiques of the former regime. But what we are seeing now is a lot of political persecutions of people of the old regime, kind of point blank. Like just today, Nahid Islam, who was one of the student leaders, said that every journalist, writer, influencer that was associated, not even like part of the parliament, associated with the former regime, is going to be put to brought in the books. I don't even know what that means. So I wonder if the middle class nature of the students and the fact that they had aspired to become the national capitalists of the country is becoming a fault line, because even some of the philosophical wings of the student movement, like Mahfouz Abdullah, last month put out a Facebook status saying that we need to create a national bourgeoisie in Bangladesh. That is our task at hand, to fight against Indian hegemony. And I think it also goes back to your question, David, about the role of workers here. If the students' goal now is to create a national bourgeoisie, so what are some of the fault lines, in your opinion, given this context?
I guess you guys have clearly sparked a lot of interesting questions. I'm not seizing. We have one final one, I think, if you don't mind, and then we'll go to you. Sorry, it's Travis, and I didn't do the panel slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone.
With regards to the question about the post-revolution steps for Bangladesh, there are questions about whether you can call it a revolution or an uprising, and it's not clear. I guess a revolution would have to have changes reflected. So the changes, I'm not very sure if we can say that the changes have come through, except for the toppling of the government. For the changes to truly be reflected, there needs to be these systemic changes that needs to happen from the recruitment processes to the student politics that I'm talking about. And I think I'm talking about generations, because the way that student politics or party-based politics in campuses have happened, recruitments in the institutions are reflections of that. And I get messages from mid to senior ranks in the police who are saying that we were being ruled by one group of student leaders, and now we are getting ruled by another group who are getting reinstatements, who are sent into forced retirements, and then they're getting reinstatements now. It raises questions about efficiency of the system, because if someone was sent into retirement 15 years ago and out of respect is being reinstated now, 15 years later, is that cop even going to be able to fight a crime in that space? And not just that, there will be revenge mentalities of these parties, so that's there. So your question about the role of countries like China and Russia that has played in your case, in case of Iran, I think geopolitics is such that every country has a stake to some extent, and the US definitely has theirs, China has theirs, India has its own. In case of Bangladesh, despite it being a small country, it falls in those pearls where the stability is required for some countries, and when that's not happening, it can affect business, trade relations, as well as their own political interests to be in power. So China and India clearly, in case of Bangladesh, have their own interests to sort of hegemonize, or whether to have their influence in the decisions. So in case of Bangladesh, for the last 15 years, the reason India has had so much of its influence is because it didn't want China to flourish in that part. And China wants to do the same. When China sent their submarines in Bangladesh, India got tremendously insecure about why Bangladesh needs submarine. It's not at war, so that happened during that regime. So that kind of interest continues. Bangladesh's foreign policy suggests that it's friendship to all and malice to none. I think it's a safe foreign policy which doesn't speak a lot, because in that space every country has friendship with everyone and then malice to none, and then they continue with their own space. And I'd not just ramble on that. There was the question of I think the working class and middle class and the fault line that you're talking about. I am not so sure how much I can and speak about it, but I think the reflections need to come, like you mentioned, that it wasn't just about the student protests that triggered everything. The pent-up frustration that was there in everyone, and everyone kind of personally related to how they suffered in their own space, whether it was themselves directly or their family members or however. I have shared a bit about myself. I have been detained as well, and during that regime. So I have my own share of frustration, but that shouldn't also lead, this change. We are talking about a change that is collective. So it represents the working class as well. And I think as members of the intelligentsia, as civilians, we need to raise those questions that, about what kind of system you're putting in place. I can't probably go much into the discussion about bourgeois class, but it needs to have representation from all, and the working class is definitely important. We have an agrarian economy where, despite making progress in the garment sector and whatnot, it's still largely an agrarian economy where literacy is not as great as we think it has been flourishing, and those were narratives of the previous administration as well. So those who are in the policy-making space, they need to make sure that these aspirations are reflected, and that's why national referendum is so much in discussion. That it just can't be the elites who are deciding, and because we know better and we have studied. It needs to be those who are affected in different ways. I'll probably leave it at that, and I'll let you take from there the cue.
Yes, we all have personal brushes with the regime that we can't talk about. Yes. I want to actually just go back to the question about the army very quickly to say, because I keep getting asked this by friends from neighboring countries who also have Egypt in mind. It's very interesting. And I'll come back to you. I really appreciated your question. The army is very well, it has no interest in formally taking over power. Those days are over unless, you're supported, the US has an interest in you. The army needs to show itself as being very democratic. It has people in the UN, it makes a lot of money from the UN. It's got businesses all over Bangladesh. What it wants is a stable kind of situation for businesses. You're absolutely right that the army realized that Hasina ki to, they would tear her apart, but also, the army would not be very popular. But the people doing the real killing were the police, not the army. So I have a photograph, I just didn't do this properly, of the night of August 5th, where there were real army tanks finally in front of Shahbag, and people were there were these twins in all red, and somebody put their twin on the army tank and took photos and were giving the army roasts, and the army people were looking completely stunned, like what's happening? They're not used to, being there. So for a moment, I think, the army was seen as, I know there was shoot on sight orders, but the army was seen as not the police. Right now the army has become the police, as you were just saying. But that's an interesting role. The army is not interested. And Bangladesh is very lucky. It is neither Iran nor Egypt, nor Pakistan, because that is where geopolitics destroys everything. I mean, there was real democracy. In answer to your question, what is happening in Egypt, I would just push back and say there was no problem. The problem in Egypt right now is not a problem of secularization. That's a problem that they had before too. Sisi, who put Sisi in power? The US put Sisi. I have actually, before you even said it, geopolitics is really, really important. So there's geopolitics and there's also the capitalist interest that David is talking about. Those two come together. I have friends in Tunisia too, and yes, there is a lot of anxiety over Islam, but you have to actually let democracy flourish if people really want an Islamic state, which is different. I mean, that could get thorny, but I think there's an idea of thinking of places that are majority Muslim as high Islam ashte, that Jujuburi of Islam, and all women will be, then thrown under the bus, right? That's not the way to think about politics. That's not, I can tell you, my Egyptian friends are not worrying about secularism right now. Because they had maybe, and this is not to say anything about the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't know enough, but that fear, especially around Muslim women, is something we really need to get over, to think about. But I hadn't thought about the Mahsa Amini case and the similarities. I will think about that a little bit more. There was one more question. That question is really good and really important to your question about. I will say, rickshawalas gave water, scooter wallas gave free shingaras. There was a lot of empathy because people related, as Saad was saying. Garment workers died, but I know this movement. I was talking to people. I don't know why we would want to call it a people's movement, a working people's movement, when it wasn't quite. I just don't see it. Yes, there are fault lines because these students who are in their study circles with Farhat Mazhar and whoever else, well, actually in that case, but they weren't necessarily wanting to topple the entire system. Of course there are fault lines. Of course there are, and there will be, as one would expect. So, yeah, thank you. But that was a really good question. I mean, yeah.
Okay, on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. Oh, the role of the opposition should be. I think you can't do the role of the opposition, Shari. I think you need to look. You can't solve practical problems without actually looking a little bit at the history. And we need a real opposition to do that. You can't just say you're Islamist and so you're out.
On that note, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. First in our series, and clearly we could have gone for 2 more hours. Thank you so much for coming.
There I was thinking, where are these things? 12 to 2. I texted her, and I said at the front.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. As you know, we have more lined up for the rest of the year, and please come along and bring your friends. Okay. I think we are going to have a picture as well. So come.
I don't know. I never look at the Indian media. I just